Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of March 24th, and this is your Monday briefing. The House and Senate are back in session with 3 weeks to negotiate the respective budget resolutions. House leadership reportedly wants to see final legislation passed by Memorial Day.
Among the executive orders issued in January, the president signed one that would determine a U.S. response to foreign countries if they impose discriminatory or extraterritorial taxes against U.S. citizens or corporations. Several reports were expected in response to the executive orders. One was expected last week, and the other is expected April 1. The report due last week reportedly will not be made public for a while. So here to shed some light on what's at stake is Nils Cousin. Nils, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So why don't we start with a brief background on Section 891 and 899 and what all of that entails, and why is it that the Trump administration is so focused on these?
Sure. So Section 899 is proposed legislation. It's not been enacted, but essentially what it would do if it was enacted is it would let the Congress, through reports, determine whether certain countries are imposing extraterritorial or discriminatory taxes on U.S. persons. And if they do, then there's a ramp up of tax rates that are imposed on citizens and residents of those countries. The rates will increase incrementally by 5% and then up to a total of 20%. Section 891, however, is a provision in our Internal Revenue Code that exists right now. It's been in force since 1934, I believe. It's never actually been applied, but what Section 891 does is it lets the president determine that a country is imposing extraterritorial or discriminatory taxes on U.S. citizens or U.S. corporations. And if the president makes that determination, then the rates of tax, withholding tax, and Section 1, Section 11 corporate or individual income taxes would immediately be doubled on citizens or corporations of that country. Section 891 is also very interesting because if the declaration is made by the president at some point during the tax year, then those rates would actually, the doubling of rates would actually take effect for the retroactively to the beginning of the tax year. And even if the declaration is rescinded the next day, the rates would not revert back to normal until the end of the year.
So with regard to company reactions, what has been their perspective and what other things might have occurred since those executive orders were first announced?
We're certainly getting a lot of questions from companies, and both in respect of their potential fear that if they're an inbound company, let's say from a country that the Trump administration might be targeting for having extraterritorial taxes. Really, it's the UTPRs under Pillar 2 that they're focused on, and also digital service taxes. So you're seeing questions and a little bit of confusion. And then also, the same thing really does apply for Section 891, at least, to individuals who are citizens of that country that may actually be living over here on sort of secondment agreements or arrangements or things like that. There's a lot of worry there as well.
All right. And whether or not the upcoming reports are made public, what are you anticipating, and what are you anticipating is the next step for companies?
Well, it's hard to predict what is going to happen. And there is a theory that one of the reasons that they're not making the reports public is the Section 891 is intended to be something that can be used to get countries to hopefully repeal their extraterritorial taxes or things like that. And there's a fear, I think, that if the report is made public and, let's say, lists certain countries as being on it now, that would actually force the president to put those countries on the list. Because the way that Section 891 is phrased, it says if the president determines that there's an extraterritorial country, then the rates shall be doubled. So that's why I think one of the reasons that they might not be releasing it publicly right now. It's really DSDs and UTPRs that are probably the targets. So if you are a company that's resident of a country that has those or is going to have those go into effect, then I think you need to focus on it very carefully. But a lot remains to be seen, because ultimately I think the point of these executive orders is to try to get other countries to repeal their UTPRs or delay their their entry into force. That's really what I think they're trying to do with this.
All right, and a quick follow-up, if 899, for example, were to pass, do you have a sense of how countries would respond?
We've heard at least some things that even surprised me, that there are certain countries that I thought, well, if anyone's going to say, I'll keep my UTPR, I'll do that. But we've actually heard some noise that that countries may comply here. They may do away with it. Of course, UTPRs generally have been enacted in the EU countries, but would go into effect at the beginning of next year. So certainly, even if 899 were passed and a report comes out the next day that the EU countries that have UTPRs are on the list, or even if an 891 declaration is issued, in theory, it may not apply until that tax actually goes into effect, which wouldn't be until next year. So certainly that leaves, at this point, a good 9 months to try to resolve this issue. I think it will be a little bit more difficult on digital service taxes because those countries that have enacted them, those are in effect now.
Right.
And finally, Nils, with regard to the company perspective again, what are some actions that they might consider taking both before implementation and perhaps even if it were to go into effect?
Well, one of the questions that I think people have had is, let's say that you are in a EU country and you are a company there that has a U.S. subsidiary, and dividend, a regular dividend withholding tax rate is 30%. If it's Section 891 declaration is made, that jumps up to 60%. There's still actually a lot of uncertainty, at least under 891, whether it would override an income tax treaty or not. But the question that we're getting is, should companies accelerate payments? But one reason that I think a lot that are looking at that are deciding instead maybe to delay payments. It's that thing I mentioned at the beginning, that if an 891 declaration is made, it's actually retroactive to the beginning of the tax year.
Nils, thank you so much for your insight today. Really appreciate you being with us.
Absolutely. Glad to be here.
Thanks. Last week, Sindhu spoke with Nicole Flax about how the IRS has been affected by the changes and cuts imposed by the Trump administration. A link to that interview is in the description of this episode, along with the latest Week in Review with Carl Russo.
And we're continuing to follow all things tax, tariffs, and the economy, so stay with Policy on Demand for insight from our team here in Washington. We appreciate you spending this time with us and hope you have a great week. Take care.